Every time a new ban list comes out, a number of individuals post online their opinions regarding what will be the top decks of the format. Instead of another top 10 best deck list, I wanted to put together a list of the top 10 most competitive non-meta decks for the current format, similar to the list I posted back in October. So with that introduction out of the way, here we go. First, before beginning, I think it's important to note that I did not include Satellarknights or Necros in this list because I view both these decks as meta, otherwise both would certainly have been on the list. One of the biggest mysteries of the competitive scene since Worlds for me is why people are no longer playing either Satellarknights or Necros with any level of real frequency. Satellarknights now have access to Solemn Strike to bolster back row annoyance. I can't imagine the emergence of Twin Twister and the loss of 2 reinforcement of the army was so detrimental that it would cause people to run from Satellarknights like rats off a sinking ship. The drop-off of Necros is even more perplexing because while Shrit was certainly a quality card, it wasn't the linchpin to the deck itself. There are a number of suitable substitutes that lead to little drop-off. Finally, both decks still have their big boss monsters. Necros still has Trishula, Satellarknights still have Travere. So I just don't really understand why everyone just abandoned ship so quickly when both decks are still very competitive. Finally, with the release of Shining Victory, I expect Blue Eyes to be meta in popularity, maybe not competitiveness, so it's not on the list. Alright, number 10. Speedroids. Pure Speedroids have significant levels of recursion and advantage production. I said in my Speedroid deck creation a while ago, which definitely needs to be updated by now, but if you're not able to put a Synchro Monster on the field every turn with your Speedroid deck, you either drew horribly or you have bad deck design. The wide variety of Synchro plays produce a numerous means of removal, including easy access to Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon. The problem for Speedroids, of course, though, it's very dependent on its synchro plays to accomplish anything of note, which is fine against a deck like Burning Abyss or even Cosmos, but against a deck like Pendulums that can just continue to swarm the field, and especially against Monarchs, can make for some tough sledding, so to speak. But that's where proper deck design comes in. You have to throw in those unique techs to get around those situations. Number 9. Superheavy Samurai. I'm a huge advocate of Superheavy Samurai. I'm really kind of annoyed that you don't see more Superheavy Samurai decks out there. I think one of the principal reasons for this is horrible deck design. People just throw a bunch of Superheavy Samurais in a deck and say, there's my 40 monster deck, I'm done. It's like, oh gosh, what did you do to this deck? What did you do to this archetype? Why? The strengths of Superheavy Samurai: removal options. They have bounce, they have battle destruction, they have card destruction. They are rather consistent at putting a valid threat on the field due to their numerous recursion effects. Big Ben is one of the best, no crazy requirements for the summons monsters in the game, and is rather difficult for a lot of the meta decks to get over. They need that 1 or 2 specific outs that they run in their deck. And most of the time, you're just going to put Big Ben back on the field with your monster effect recursion ability. I think the major weakness and the big turnoff to Superheavy Samurais is clearly the lack of almost every type of spell or trap in the game. Place this deck somewhat at a disadvantage when it comes to making those explosive, holy crud, look at that board plays. And they have that up and down Monarch matchup. Stormforth, utter annoyance for this deck. Number 8. Despots. Initially, I was going to keep this deck off the list because it's become a little too trendy for my taste. But I was an early advocate for Despots, and they've only gotten better since then. The strengths of Despots simply lie in their ability to compound damage into a single strike, be it from 003's effect or 009's effect, and swarm the field to enhance this damage ability via 001, 003, or 004's effect. While Despots lack a variety of removal options, this attack concentration trait limits the detriment of this lack of utility. Similar to Chronomaly, all Despots need is a single monster in attack mode or an empty field, and they can OTK an opposing player with a simple attack. Despots have decent matchups with both Monarchs and Cosmos. The main weakness of Despots is that they are jokingly easy to side against, because this lack of removal options give them the same general weakness as a deck like Moondancers, in that a single monster that cannot be destroyed as a result of battle, and the entire deck is stymied. Of course, this is only one of many anti-Deskbot strategies. Also, Despots are somewhat dependent on the effects of 003 and 004 to really get their plays started. Otherwise, they can be run over by the meta decks rather easily, because without 003 or 004 to really start their engine, they're just setting a lot of 500 attack point monsters out on the field. Number 7. Yosenju. Yosenju is an interesting deck because I don't think the conventional build can get it done. I think there's too much focus on back row and not enough firepower in the deck. If you looked at my recent Yosenju build, I think if you run some of the higher level monsters, you'll have much more success against the meta decks, because then you have the firepower to get over them more consistently. The strengths of Yosenju are numerous bounce and deck return options to neutralize graveyard-based floaters, most notably in things like Burning Abyss and PK Fire, strong OTK potential, quality searchability, especially for getting that secret move, which is basically a quasi-solemn judgment. The weaknesses, of course, are the most obvious. It's prone to being OTK'd because of questionable field presence, although I think using the bigger monsters gives it better field presence, and it has low special summoning ability, which places reliance more on the normal summon, and it does have a tough matchup against Cosmos. I think if Solemn Strike went from 3 to 1, Yosenju's probably would be a little higher on this list. Number 6. Unfortunately, the number 1 from the last list has fallen a little due to the switch in the meta. However, despite this fall, Chronomalies are still a top-notch deck that gets almost no love. It can still make any generic rank 3 through 5 with the potential to realistically reach 6 from time to time. With a solid machine presence and significant direct recursion, it can frequently make Cyber Infinity along with both Pallades and Gorgonic Guardian. The deck still has quality OTK potential despite the shift in the meta. It is consistent with above average speed and one of the only decks I can remember that can search for an attack increasing continuous spell to help it get over decks that typically run bigger monsters. The variety and consistency of the deck make it a legitimate threat against any deck. While Chronomalies do not have many weaknesses, the shift in the meta has significantly hurt their overall explosiveness. The anti-targeting nature of the meta has hurt their ability to drop massive damage and OTK their opponent through number 33 and number 36's effect. This change has forced their deck designs to focus more on raw attack power rather than combo-oriented finesse. Another minor weakness is that, like many decks, Chronomalies do not float, but due to their special summoning abilities and versatility, they can typically rebuild a board better than a number of other decks. Number 5. Well, it's time to throw that logical curveball here. Gem Knights. Gem Knights are one of those decks where it's difficult to understand how scary the deck can be unless you've played it or played against a quality player running one. Gem Knight Fusion is one of the most powerful cards in the game despite no one talking about it. Summons Negation back row can actually be worn out by this deck. For a number of decks, on the first turn you get Solemn Warning. That basically ends your turn. For this deck, not so much. The synergy this deck has with itself is rather ridiculous, as one of its major strengths is the ability to drop 2 to 5 quality fusion monsters on the field in a single turn with only its direct support. No outside cards like instant fusion or generic revival cards. The fusion lineup is diverse enough to address almost any monster threat in addition to combining battle and burn damage for significant OTK potential. Gem Knights pretty much are one of the flat-out best OTK decks in the game. However, the not surprising weakness of this deck is that it is a fusion deck, so it relies on both Gem Knight Fusion and to a lesser extent Brilliant Fusion. If you don't get them into your hand, you're going to have a problem. Fortunately, smart deck design alleviates a lot of this dependency problem, but it does not eliminate it. Also, Gem Knights hate going first due to the lack of general defense capacity for the most efficient Gem Knight decks, because they typically lack a lot of back row. Number 4. Firefists are another one of those perplexing decks that seem to have all the tools to be competitive, but I guess have been branded as kind of power creeped or so out of date that the decks are just simply abandoned. Firefists have a variety of monster removal means: targeted destruction, targeted deck return, targeted hand return, and battle destruction. All of the targeting in that list may scare some people off, I guess, but the fists can get beefy enough with some help, both direct and indirect, to destroy monsters consistently via battle. Fists are one of the most consistent decks in the game, pumping out advantage almost every turn and almost never bricking. Their searching ability both improves general deck advancement and produces a solid level of versatility for handling opponent threats. Unfortunately, being an older deck, the one major weakness of Firefists is they are prone to being OTK'd because despite having the tools to produce quality and consistent field presence, Fists don't float, and typically do not have a lot of back row to prevent attacks. However, despite this weakness, Firefists should see much more play than they do for their level of quality. Number 3. UAs. The number 2 deck on the last list is no longer number 2. So what's the deal? Well, on the positive side, UAs are still one of the most versatile decks in the game, with monster negation when battling from Slugger, which has become especially important in this meta, monster effect negation from Blockbacker, free UA monsters from Rebounder, card destruction from Dunker, destruction protection from Goalkeeper, and overall card effect negation from Perfect Ace. The deck is still rather fast and consistent due to the multiple searches, both spell and monster based, allowing it to get to these options more effectively. Finally, it can still drop that OTK with almost no setup through the best equipped card in the game, Jersey. Jersey is another one of those broken cards that no one talks about because people don't play the deck that runs it. The problem with UA is the change in meta decks has screwed up their pacing. In the past, a player could sit on Perfect Ace and or Blockbacker for a few turns before attacking to set up their board. Now, so many various non-destruction removal options as well as other playmaking options exist that such a strategy is more risky. You can still sit on Perfect Ace, it's just the opponent now has a higher probability of getting rid of it. This lack of stall efficiency hurts the potency of the deck due to the lack of immediate opponent turn action capacity for the deck, i.e. the lack of floatiness. UAs are also hurt because their biggest defensive threats, Backer at 27, Keeper at 28, and especially Ace at 25, can be run over more often by Cosmos and Monarchs than past meta decks. However, these weaknesses notwithstanding, UAs are still much better than most people seem to realize. Number 2. Batterymen. I still will never really understand why Batterymen basically fell off the face of the earth when it came to Yugioh. They have an even matchup against pretty much any major meta deck. They have large levels of recursion and searching, can produce large-scale attack from almost nothing, versatile monster removal options via battle destruction, effect destruction, bounce, and tributing through Monarch Stormforth. Their weaknesses tend to be they have limited support options due to the lack of available quality Batteryman monsters. If ever there was a deck that needs support, Batterymen one of them. They have sometimes they have unstable attack values because basically Batterymen need certain conditions to get those huge hitters on the field, whereas Cosmos, Monarchs, and Burning Abyss can routinely put big hitters on the field with less effort. In my opinion, I think for Batterymen to really succeed in the current meta, you have to play more of a defensive build. Number 1. Madolche is a great example of how a deck can simply lean on a single monster and be ridiculously competitive. Queen Tiramisu is a threat against almost every monster in the game. It's rather easy to get on the field with the right deck build, and typically produces huge negatives for the opponent. While the deck does lean on Tiramisu, it can produce enough advantage due to its natural graveyard return effects, especially when combined with Chateau, to achieve a large enough field presence to ward off attacks in between Queen Summon, and even finish off a few duels here and there. The only weakness this deck has is that due to Queen's effect, it is more of a counterattack deck rather than a tempo deck. Thus, it doesn't have a strong first turn and needs to play more defensively at the start of the duel. Fortunately, there are a number of defensive cards in the game which support this type of strategy. However, it must be noted that this number 1 ranking is hedged on the fact that Reaper does not execute the Queen from the extra deck. Otherwise, Madolche are basically in the same boat as Burning Abyss and a bunch of other decks. Seriously, who designed Reaper when the Unspeakable Grimoire was a perfectly fair card that accomplished the exact same goal? So that's my top 10 list of the most competitive decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! That aren't meta and in general just see a lot less play than they deserve based on their quality. Is there a deck that you think should have been on the list but wasn't? You can check out the first comment below to see my reasoning on why a number of other possible candidates did not make the cut, as well as post those decks you think should have made the cut. With that, thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.